Everybody, welcome to the 9th evening of the Gainesville Jewish Film Festival, the 11th annual Gainesville Jewish Film Festival. Today's film was Leona, and tonight's speaker is Professor Maureen Toureem. Professor Toureem is an expert in film, one of the few true experts in film we actually have, and she has written a number of books. One, Abstraction in Avant-Garde Films, another, Flashbacks in Film, Memory and History, and she is currently working on Desire and Its Ends, the driving forces of recent cinema, literature, and art. Everyone, I'm pleased to present Dr. Maureen Toureem.
Thank you, and thank everybody for coming. I'll say just a few things about the film and then open it up for discussion. It's a pretty accessible film. The most interesting thing about it, in my estimation, is it's centering on the Syrian community in Mexico City. And that is a historical community that dates from the turn of the 20th century and was largely in exile from another civil war in Syria. So Syria's had its share of Soros. And what's interesting is that it's a community that was split historically between those from Aleppo and those from Damascus, who belonged to different synagogues. And there was this kind of separate identity to the two communities, even though they were both in exile in Mexico, but that has since somewhat dissipated. But apparently they're quite separate from the Ashkenazi community, Jewish community in Mexico, which is also really interesting. They have, amongst the Syrian community, they have the lowest rate of intermarriage of any Jewish community outside of Israel, which is pretty intriguing and sort of situates the film at a little bit more of an edge for that community than it would have in the United States. It certainly belongs to a romance genre. The film itself tips its hat to a tragic romance, Romeo and Juliet, that the father, who is a theater director of the love interest, Ivan, the non-Jew, is involved with producing at a certain point in the film. But it also, I thought, was really interesting to compare to Joan Micklin Silver's Crossing Delancey from 1988, which is one of my all-time favorite films. It's quite charming. And especially with the sort of set up dates that are disappointing. There's a series of those in Crossing Delancey as well, but very similar sort of woman taken with the world of the arts that pulls her out of the community. In her case, it's literature, and it has a very different ending. So if you haven't seen that one, I strongly recommend it. But also I was thinking of Unorthodox, the TV series from 2020 that many of you have seen, which also has the woman pulled out of the community by her interest in music and includes actually emigrating and leaving a husband. So there are interesting kinds of comparisons in structure. Another thing that I think is worth paying attention to is the water imagery in the film. and starting with the mikveh and ending with the bath. And I have some ideas about that, but maybe toss that open to discussion. It's a very complicated family situation. A only child in Ariella of divorced parents, but a very large and close extended family. And how that gets contrasted in the cross-cutting with the artistically bent non-Jewish family is fascinating. And the difference of the friendships in the non-Jewish community, which seem to be very connected to drinking culture and bars and music and dancing. And we never see anything quite the same in the Jewish community, although we see very strong friendships. And this intense pressure to marry and to already be thinking about children that is felt throughout the film, and nobody taking seriously her own questioning of whether marriage is the path for her. And she says a couple times, I don't want children. So trying to figure out her identity is pretty fascinating. One of the things that is interesting is how important the muralist tradition is in Mexico historically. And we can discuss what they're trying to do with the graphics of the murals that are actually shown in the film. She has a hard heritage to live up to, let's put it that way, since it is such a strong tradition in that country. And the other thing we might talk about is how wealthy the entire community is presented as being, and what their attitudes are towards parts of the city that are less wealthy than they are. So with that, I think I'll open it to questions and comments. Go ahead.
Thank you for doing this. And when I first saw the film, I thought it was like a slight film. Like I wasn't that impressed with it. And so oftentimes I find the second viewing the films, I like them a lot more. And I certainly, this is the case in point where I really liked a lot more this viewing. It's beautifully photographed and beautifully acted. I think she's terrific, and she really she has wonderful charisma on camera. What struck me about it is, so comparing it to the most recent films we've looked at, is this whole issue of transgression and violation of community boundaries, and also the tragedy of people seeking their own selves that can only come about by violating the community that they would like to be members of. And she clearly wants to be an artist, wants to be able to also have, the kind of romantic life that she wants, has obviously nothing in common with the kind of men she would be paired up with in that community. They're all businessmen. But there's more to her. And what's interesting is when she's watching the play with her boy, with Ivan, Ivana falls asleep during the play, and her eyes are wide open looking at it. I thought that was very striking. It shows that even that match is a problematic match. It's not clear. It seemed to me it's fairly evident it'd be very difficult for her to find the right man to be paired with. So, and the theme, the idea of Leona, her idea of a lioness, is, I don't know much about lions, but I take it that they hunt alone or something. But there's something about that, some metaphor about aloneness, and that seems to me to run through the film. And she's not, you can't marry her off and solve her problems, make her happy. She's a very interesting person, And she's interesting in her own right, irrespective of who's there to fall in love with, or for them to fall in love with her. And I thought it's interesting from that standpoint. I do want to know what you have to say about the second mikveh, the ending in the bathtub. You said you had some ideas. I'm curious what they are.
Well, it's set up as a suicide.
Interesting.
And then she changes her mind. Yeah.
And well, but no, we never know if that was her idea. It is simply set up dramatically with her dropping all of her clothes in front of the picture window and going off to this bath and then dunking her head underneath. And then you realize it's her own mikveh that she's created to start over again.
Yeah. It's a rebirth scene, really.
Yeah.
It also struck me that there was interesting symbolism between the fact that the first mikveh, all of these women are around saying how wonderful it is. They're praising her. And in her mikveh, she is alone. You know, and I think that's very symbolic. She doesn't stand for the values that the rest of her community is trying to push onto her.
Yeah.
Maureen, didn't you find that in the film she was there was so much going on in her mind that she wasn't expressing and couldn't express to those groups, and a lot of the scenes were then just sort of cut off, you know, and so she's very rarely does she really express herself fully verbally, but in other ways in the film.
Yeah, and in that she's a little bit like Shira Haas in Unorthodox, who says a lot of her reactions simply by a stare and a unwillingness to please. So she, you know, it's a kind of, you see resistance on her face, you see disconcerting kind of takes on what other people are saying. When Gabrielle, the most pleasant of the Jewish shows up. Pardon?
No, I'm kidding. I said it's not saying much, but
well, that's the whole riff, right? Of
yeah.
You know, schlub. Okay, he's
okay.
You know, and when he shows up for that surprise at one of the Shabbat dinners, her face is just like, what did I do to deserve this kind of look? So she says a lot by emotion. Yeah, go ahead, Norm.
I don't know if men are allowed to complain about the representation of men. You'll I don't want to step out of line, but the only normal men in the movie are non-Jews, and I'm curious if you think, I mean, which may be true to life. I'm not saying that's not, but I'm wondering if you find this more to be, you know, some kind of a production statement, or is it supposed to be simply comic, or is it? I was just
who was the positive male character in the film?
Or her boyfriend, I guess.
Yvonne is her father is as well.
I think her father.
Yvonne's
His father. I don't know. I thought her father was kind
of. His father.
Yeah.
It's interesting, very sympathetic, you know, he clearly has a warm relationship with her. It's
I mean, I get it, the parade of bachelors is kind of.
No, but Yvonne as well. I mean, he was you know, he was like he was Romeo for a second, but you know, he didn't really care. He just wanted to meet the family, right? He didn't care that her situation is complicated. He was completely involved himself. They didn't try to talk about you know, about the relationship or it progressing. He just demanded to see her family or break up the relationship, right? So he was also not open, which I think it's great. I think no male character really comes out positive, but not many characters beside Ariella are actually positive or comforting,
Yeah, maybe sure. Yeah.
or she's sort of alone against the world, and she's only 25, right? She's just 25,
Was
so she
old,
has.
old in that world. But you're missing something else, I think, and that is that it's very interesting that his friends ask Ivan whether he's going to get circumcised.
Mm.
And why don't they ask whether she's going to convert to Catholicism? And I find that very, very interesting, that that's not an issue there. Now, it may be that there's stuff that's not filled in that we're supposed to know, namely that they're fairly secular, they're not, this would not be an issue for them. I mean, that's the case in many, many, many parts of the world. Or it may be that they know how strong that family is, how strong the Syrian Jewish community is. And if you want entry into that community, you have to, if it's at all possible, you have to convert to them. You can't expect them to convert to you. I don't know, but I found it an interesting omission that discussion didn't happen.
Yeah, no, yeah. Now that you say it, it's interesting. But I'm just talking from experience and people I know. I mean, usually interfaith couples are either they stay in each one's religion, or the goy converts to Judaism. It's rarely the Jew converts to Christianity. But again, I guess it's just based on my maybe that's why I didn't think about it at all, because it seemed a normal question. Yeah, if you want to be in a relationship with a Jewish person, you need to convert.
Yeah, but that's only true in the United States and recently.
Right.
Historically, in Europe, it was the other way. That and it has everything to do with Reform Judaism opening itself up to religious conversion, which doesn't exist in the same way in these more traditional Jewish communities. Remember, the rabbi in the film says, "We do not proselytize and we do not convert." And so I think that's part of what's being played out. I think what you folks are saying about the negative version of the males is interesting, because it's a male director, writer. And I saw an interview with him in which how come he decided to make his lead character female. And he said, basically, I find women more interesting, and I grew up with sisters, and he basically said some things about that, but there's another male character who's very positive in the film, and you're missing him.
Cool.
The grandfather.
It's so for no.
The gay cousin.
Oh, right. Yeah, he was. Yeah, he seemed a little minor in the story, but yeah, her character Ariella, I thought this was almost a character we're used to seeing as a male, this artist who sort of can't be expected to have to spell everything out, because in terms of what kind of character Ariella was, I mean, sympathetic in some ways, but I mean, I think Judy said this earlier, she doesn't have the necessary conversations, which on the one hand, I have sympathy for, because she's young, and, in the US, this would be considered, early stages of serious relationships. So I feel like something you learn over time. You need to when Ivan wanted to be introduced to the family, I thought part of it was he wanted to be let in, and she could have let him in also by explaining to him, this is what it's like. I want you to understand. But we never see her trying to let him in through conversation. She seems, I thought, pretty bad at communication in both of the relationships we saw her in.
Well, I take what you're saying, Rachel, and I would go even further, that the hesitancy to bring her into the family is her own hesitancy. That it's not her family who finally decides against the relationship. She resists their pressure, but she decides against it. And which makes the one night stand, if we take the cutting that way, because it's a little bit ambiguous whether it's a flashback or a one night stand after the relationship is over. But after, when they meet for the drink, and he says, Ivan says he has a girlfriend, and then we have a sex scene, and then we go on with the narrative. It seems like she's drawn to him, but she's not drawn enough to him. And that it's her decision finally, even if it's kind of a backdoor way of going about communicating it.
Maureen, one of the things that the film shows is the depth of the relationship is very superficial. That when they're unpacking, and she goes to he's talking about life at work, etc., and she goes over to unpack some of the boxes. He gets very agitated that she's not sitting by him, listening to him with total rapture, and she imitates that what he wants of her. And then later in the film, sort of something comparable happens where he's talking and she doesn't pay enough attention, or rather she's talking, he doesn't have any interest in what she's saying. So as a relationship, it's not a very interesting relationship. It's a very sensual, sexual relationship. It's part of the beauty of the film. The sex scenes are very, very beautiful. But the relationship, no.
I thought the movie should have been titled Hobson's Choice, because I really felt, and I felt this powerfully at the end, that this was a woman torn between two terrible alternatives. I mean, and I really expected her to take her own life. I don't think that was I think that she was seriously considering it, because if she went with her heart and went with Ivan, she would be cut off from her family. And if she went with her family, she would be perpetually unhappy with her husband and with the situation. And I thought, I appreciated this movie because the director didn't go soft and try to make everything okay at the end, but left us with her despair. And I thought what was interesting about it is, I understand that there are traditionalist communities that are heavy on tribalism, but I was struck by both when the Shaleach went to talk to her and when the rabbi talked to her. I wouldn't have stayed within the community based on what they said. I mean, if they thought they were actually bringing her into the community, there was no talk about the beauty of the community or the tradition. It's what's going to happen to you if you're on the outside. Yeah. And that's why it reminded me of ultra-Orthodox, much more so. And I thought, she could have the future of her friend, who clearly had totally devolved into the role of, mother of countless children, or cut off her family. And I felt, very sad for her, that neither alternative was going to make her happy.
But also remember that she didn't really have someone in Ivan whom she could bring into the community because he would fit, or he's such there's a real soulmate match between them. It sort of really has a little bit of a one night stand component to it, where she's sort of, sowing her wild oats, but this is not a serious person for her. And I think what we see in the relationship is the limitations of the relationship. So she's caught in a very funny place. She's in between. So that's my take on it.
Well, I think you're right. Oh, sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I think she might like the culture more than Ivan, or more than Ivan, in that way. That the world where they go to plays, they talk about art and culture and the like, even if he's just a component of that. I also think she fell in love more with his family than perhaps with him.
Absolutely, wouldn't you?
But still, it was torn between two worlds, neither of which I think she could have without terrible cost. So,
Jamie made a comment. Do you want me to read it, Jamie, or do you want to speak it?
I can speak it. I'm just, so for me, I don't know. I felt like she was kind of learning to be on her own and, what her life was going to be for her.
Absolutely. What about the progression of the murals? Did anyone pay attention to that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it did seem to me as though the first mural was tons and tons of faces. And as time went on, the murals had fewer and fewer faces in them. It's like I'm cutting myself off from all these people and I'm down to one face at the end. But I noticed that. There may have been other features as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely, that's what's going on. And at first it's the faces in a crowd, and then there's this sort of surreal element of all these animals with faces. And then the final mural where the single face is like triumphant and very large. So it does seem like part of what is trying to be indicated is that she comes into her own in a certain way, that she has a certain power at the end that she didn't have earlier.
Mhm. I want to point out also other transgressions within the film, which are, very, very interesting. When Yvonne takes her to the pork place, and it's clear she's never been in that neighborhood before. Judy, you had your hand up, I think. Judy, you're on mute.
Unmute.
You're still on mute.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you unmute?
She is on.
Yeah,
She's not muted.
sorry.
Something's not
Frustrating.
working.
Sorry.
You can write it in the chat,
Yeah.
Judy.
I agree with part of what the discussion is about in terms of her coming to her own, because she does entitle the last mural Lioness. I think that's important. But I also want to raise a comment about the women and men thing and how genders are represented. I don't think the women are represented particularly well in this film either. I mean, I don't, even though Ariel is a leading character and we're supposed to feel sympathy for her, I think she mishandled a lot of things about that relationship. And she refused to talk to him and she lied to him. And I don't think she was presented in super positive light either. Or any of the other women, the mother, the grandmother.
The mother for sure not.
The mother not, yeah.
Well, I mean, the mother, I guess in a way I had sympathy for, in that it's like, she's so part of this society, and, and here she is divorced. I can't imagine. And, she's got to go on all of these own bad dates of her own. And, and her daughter's making her look worse. And it's a community where everyone's sort of staring at them. So, yeah, and when I heard that thing about the grandmother being married at 15, it seemed like, all right, well, there's the root of the problem, is that, everyone's is forced into these situations before they know how to, be in relationships and communicate with people.
I want to put it another way, the idea of the root of the problem is this problematic term for me, because we're looking at sort of the human tragedy, the ways in which culture puts us in iron. What is it? It just forces us into certain modes of behavior, which in theory, if you take it from the standpoint of contemporary culture, or what we think we're entitled to, that's not how things actually work. And you pay a certain price for being members of that community. You get certain benefits. In their case, they're very material benefits. You're guaranteed to be able to make a living, to be reasonably well in that community. You're going to be very well off, but you can't do anything you want to do. You have to abide by his rules. And from our standpoint, this is terrible. But in terms of how the world works and how societies work, ever since the beginning of time, this is how it works. And we have problems accepting it. And I think the metaphor of the artist, who is supposed to be the person breaking the shackles and going out on their own and sort of, pushing back the waves and so on, the frontier, it's a very false idea that people can actually do that and not pay a price for it. So I don't think the film is very profound, but if it were, it would be investigating the very fact that you pay a price for this. And that's what we saw in the film last night, the price paid for being gay, and that the kind of exclusions that happen because of it, and the tragedy, the human tragedy of it. So here's, I think, a lighter story. It's not, we don't get the full sense of the tragedy the way it is for gay people in Israel. But I think there's a leitmotif that runs through some of these films, really about the human tragedy.
But yeah, I know. I definitely see what you're saying, Jack. I'm just thinking. But things are not stagnant, right? Even inside this community that she's in, and that here we see three generations, and we have we're moving from the grandmother who had to marry, right? Who had arranged marriage at 15 and 3 kids at 18. Right, so we kind of progress then to her kids being able to marry in the community, but get a divorce, right? So and then this entire burden of the Mexican Jewish community falls on this little on this kid. So what would be the next step, and do we allow certain freedoms, right, as times progress? Because if that wasn't be the case, Ariela would also have to get married, arranged marriage at 15, right?
Well, 25.
20.
They progressed.
Yeah.
But that's what they're saying. That's their roadmap to happiness. That's what it is. You may have a different roadmap, but you're not part of that culture.
Mm. Yeah, but they are. I was struck. We have a beautiful sex scene right at the beginning with
Yvonne and
Yvonne, and then we have a sex scene that we kind of see the preparation, but it's in the parents' house, right, and it's on the bed, but it's sort of we see that they're preparing it and sort of to have relationship missionary, kind of missionary, right? So all the beautiful romantic sex that we had in the first scene sort of goes away, and then in that sort of the last one with Yvonne, right? The anticlimactic scene, he also has relationships with her, in missionary style, similar to the Jewish boyfriend. So it's like inside the community, outside the community. It's kind of, I'm just wondering if the director's kind of saying, it's just all blood, it's all the same. These are all things that
we don't really know what the director's saying, but although Maureen might, because she read more than we read. But I do think that again, to me, it speaks to the issue as a tragedy. She can't recapture what she gave up, what she lost, and so so the kind of sex scene is not going to be the same kind of passionate sex scene it's earlier in the film. I do want to go back to the thing that Norm said, because I think he's correct about the ways in which men are portrayed in the film. And I don't think one has to be overly defensive as a man to say this, that there is a tendency to mock Jewish men within the film. They do, sorry, there's a strong tendency to mock Jewish women too. I know that. But I'm thinking of so many films in which the men are so pathetic that you don't know what woman in the right mind will want to be with him. And I think there's a slew of films we could evoke with this. And of course, the one we had a few years ago of the Yiddish film, in which, anyway.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of various films come to my mind, but I can't think of them at the moment. So.
Yeah, if you sort of combine that comment with Roy's, I mean, the second sex scene is in the bedroom of a guy that looks like the bedroom of a 13-year-old boy. And not only does he have football stuff, he has the team he chooses is the New York Jets, the biggest losing team, of the 20th century. I guess it's all comic, it's just pretty funny, but
well, even the comic that they've got 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Although unorthodox, which Maureen brought up was similar in terms of how it, well, it's a story about an exodus, right, of a person outside of a community. So you definitely see, so it needs to portray, I assume, the community you're running away from in a sense of, in some negative light, right? So you have a sympathy with why the character is trying to break away.
Yeah.
They didn't talk about it explicitly, I don't think, but I thought, I guess, I was wondering about the race issue. In my own experience of dating someone from the Mexican Jewish community who was not Syrian, he was explaining that they really looked down on the Mexicans. And it was as if like the Jews were sort of the WASPs because like Ariella, they were often, they were fair and blonde and could be tall, and Mexicans around them, they just felt, the Jews really felt like they were inferior. And, he was sort of reflecting that in his community, it was very racist with the surrounding non-Jewish culture. And so what we were saying before about that assumption that, of course, she wouldn't be converting to the religion of this Mexican person. Of course, they would convert to yours. That seemed sort of tied to maybe some of those racist views.
Well, there are two distinct ethnicities in Syria. I'm not talking about the Jewish community now. I'm talking about in general. One which is very dark-skinned Arabic, and the other which is much more Turkish, light-skinned. And Assad comes from the light-skinned minority, which is oppressing the rest of the country right now. So I think it's maybe that the Jews in Syria even associated with skin with a certain access to power and, going back for a long time. And then that becomes reinforced with whether or not you get a tan. So keeping oneself out of the sun in order to emphasize how light one is in cultures like that is pretty striking. But I was thinking about that a lot during the film because of the visuals of seeing the two of them together versus seeing her with Gabrielle, and who is also very light-skinned. So that was pretty interesting.
I also thought the class issues were interesting. So because you have the Syrians and her family, which are clearly upper class, they're very, very prosperous. Yvonne's family, who are of an intellectual class, they don't seem to be that moneyed, but they're cultured, and that gives him that family, their habitus is higher in certain ways than the Jews, but the Jews make it up in terms of the money. But none of them are in their professions; they're all in business. Do we know what her parents did? What her father did?
We don't find out what he did, but he appears to be in high finance. Remember, he has that bodyguard.
Yeah,
that's right.
I thought it's like
something connected with money and power.
Big black Cadillac that was waiting for him there, and with the driver.
I'm not so sure is that unusual in Mexico, by the way. I'm not sure that you need to be high finance. You want to, stay alive. If you have any money, if you want to stay alive, you're going to need that.
Yeah.
And her mother, the date she was on, where the guy sends a chauffeur to pick her up. Jeez.
Yeah, maybe that's also a part of the community that's segregated, not a part of. Mexico City. I haven't been, but I hear wonderful things. The city is flourishing right now. It's not what it used to be. So maybe it's again kind of the mindset of it's dangerous outside. Well, it's not. Ariella is also facing constant questions. Are you safe? Do you feel safe on the street? Are you okay? Should I? And she's fine. She's perfectly all right. I don't think the movie presents it in any different way. So they're kind of protecting themselves from a demon that's not there.
The demon's there. I mean, but the other issue of a woman alone in that kind of way,
Yeah.
I think is what it's alluding to, and it's probably true. But it's very high crime in Mexico City, and certain parts that are very dangerous. Not so much in terms of getting killed, but of getting robbed. And it's a hell of a city. It is.
Well, when we can go back on airplanes, I would love to check it out.
A few more months.
Comments?
I
Well,
think it would
everybody,
be an interesting film to use in class.
Hmm.
um,
Yes.
Because of the age of the kids, you know. Be interesting to see how people responded.
I agree. By the way, I just want to point out that there is a very substantial Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn, huge. And they live like in an enclave, that you drive through Brooklyn and suddenly you come to a place, it looks so uniform. They have their own schools. Anybody can go, any member of that community can go to school for free. And then they tend to go on vacation to Deal, New Jersey, to the Jersey Shore. And the Jersey Shore is filled with Syrian Jews in the summer. So it's a very, very, very interesting community. Oh, by the way, Neil Sedaka comes from that community. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, think of the name.
I don't know if that community's bragging about that. But okay.
They probably are.
They should have used it in the movie. Breaking up is hard to do.
Right, exactly. Perfect. Yes.
Well, thank you, everyone, very much.
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. It's hard to believe, but there are only 3 movies left. And tomorrow, I shouldn't say tomorrow night, but tomorrow is Outremont the Hasidim about Montreal. So this has to be Jack talking back, right?
Good thinking. Yeah.
I took a guess. Anyway, everyone, thank you to Maureen. It was wonderful, fascinating film. And we'll see you tomorrow night.
Before we sign off, could I just get a show of hands? Who liked the film?
I liked it.
Anyone dislike the film? Okay.
It was a
I
win.
assume that Gail disliked it because she's not here.
No, she was
No,
not. She was
she had
still.
a COVID shot, and she
Did it?
sort of,
She the what?
The
she had
shot.
COVID shot, and
Oh.
she's,
Yeah, I figured she wasn't going to be feeling well today.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Hey.
Bye.